Paige. If you don't know Paige, Paige is like an Energizer bunny. He just works and works and works, and I've really grown to appreciate him and what he does. For everybody in this room that's interested in logistics and freight, he really has got his finger on the pulse of what's going on and making great strides. Well, probably this is the first time you've had GDOT, or will be the first time for a while. The GDOT will be the lead on doing something great for the state of Georgia in regards to logistics. Obviously, transportation is always kind of a piece of logistics, but I can assure you that transportation's got to be the cornerstone for good logistics in the future for Georgia. I'm very fortunate to have the opportunity to talk to a great group of people here, and I was trying to decide, what is the audience? And I think the audience is so wide in variety that it's kind of hard to kind of pinpoint what you target. So I'm going to talk in really just 4 different areas. I'm going to talk a little bit about the snapshot of where we are in freight, give you an update on the statewide strategic transportation plan. I'm going to dive in a little deeper into the freight planning activities that GDOT's done, and then particularly a state freight and logistics plan that will be a substate of our statewide plan. Okay, sorry about that. I got to learn how my slides are built. All right, we got some freight facts here. Just as a reminder, most of y'all have heard this data before, but Georgia has a lot of stuff coming through it, and the governor was very clear that we're kind of the cornerstone for the South, and everything that comes up from the South going to the Midwest and the North, comes through Georgia, which is great, and that's reflected by the forecast of freight flows in the future. And one thing that's kind of disappointing in Georgia is that trucks carry about 86% of all the freight moving in Georgia. And I see some of our partners in the room there with Norfolk Southern and CSX, and we would very much like to see those numbers change a little bit, where we've got a little bit more even distribution from a road network standpoint. I know trucking companies are in here as well, but I'm telling you, we've got to have a balance in the state in order to meet the demand that's coming our way. And last but not least, the truck traffic in Georgia, as anybody who drives in Georgia will know, is growing really faster than the car traffic. And everywhere you go, that's, as far as the complaints that we get on interstates, is usually all about the truck traffic. So let's talk a little bit about jobs and economy. The freight and transportation-related jobs account for about 15% of all the jobs in Georgia. You mentioned before that logistics companies alone account for 5,000 firms employing 110,000 Georgians. That's pretty big. In order to maintain that growth, and you'll see over time that job market is probably one of the more stable markets we have in Georgia as far as unemployment and everything else. Georgia's home to 6 of the top 50 cargo carriers, including the world's largest, UPS. We also have just a very efficient network in general. As a primer, and I like to tell people we get accused a lot of not having enough capacity on our roadways, but we've got a good network in Georgia. In fact, Georgia is consistently ranked as having some of the best roads in the country. In fact, if y'all read the paper yesterday in Atlanta, from a maintenance standpoint, Georgia was ranked #1 again, having the best roads in the state. And that's all part of it. We don't have the capacity that we need, but we certainly have done a good job of keeping the roads we have maintained. Now, we're on a top of a downward spiral, and I'll get to that in a little bit as far as funding goes. We're sort of at the zenith of keeping good roads. We're probably going to be on the downhill slide if we don't get some more funding toward operation and maintenance of our roadways. Cargo from Georgia is, like the governor said, within 2 days or less of 80% of the nation's commercial and industrial markets. And in your document on your table, you've got a map that shows that. I thought that was a pretty good indicator of where we stand strategically in the state, in the country to deliver. Just give you a little bit of background of where the activities that Georgia DOT is now going to go under with the Freight and Logistics Plan. The Commission for New Georgia started out, and they did a number of activities, freight and logistics being one of them. And out of that came a pretty much vision statement to be a global gateway of choice, like the governor was saying. And ultimately, they came up with a mission statement. And in that mission statement, they mentioned the words capacity, capability, connectivity. And those are the types of mission statement and words that drive us to develop a more in-depth freight and logistics plan. So you start with the Commission of New Georgia. You kind of zero in a little bit, and we did the investing in tomorrow's transportation today, IT3, which I'm going to mention in a moment, and then you dive into the statewide plan at a much lower level. All right, the statewide plan. This is the overall vision for the state. Now, we came up with goals and objectives that may be similar to other plans in other states, but these goals and objectives, in our desire and hope, will be strategically employed in the future. It laid out really 4 different areas. The first is making sure that you support Georgia's economic growth. Now, obviously that's what this group is all about. We're wanting to support Georgia logistics because we know that's a big driver in economic development. But there's a lot of other reasons you do it from economic development. The jobs that the transportation industry by itself creates for building roads, and then ultimately the jobs that it creates by getting people to jobs work quicker in a more reliable fashion. Number 2 is obviously making sure we have safe and secure roads throughout the state. That is a desire that probably most organizations have at the top of their food chain. Safety is number 1. We know that, and it implies that way as well on the roadway, making sure our roads are as safe as possible. And then number 3 is really maintaining and optimizing the existing network we have today. You may not realize it, but here in Atlanta, we have a very elaborate incident management program. You've seen the little hero trucks. We've got a very elaborate intelligent transportation system where we have cameras up all over our network. Those are activities to make sure that we optimize the system we have today. It's very important that we do that. And if we don't do that, obviously we're going to fall by the wayside with other jurisdictions that are doing it. But most importantly, we don't have enough money to ever fix all the roads in Atlanta to meet the demands and capacity constraints that are out there. So we need to do these activities. Carpooling, getting people to ride share together, getting companies to work alternate work hours. Those are activities that we support as an agency through Georgia DOT funding a group like Clean Air Campaign. Y'all probably heard about them. In fact, Georgia has one of the better management systems in the country as far as that goes right here in the Atlanta area. Now, obviously, what you're going to find out by 2030 or 2040, our second-tier cities in Georgia, the Savannahs, the Augustas, are going to need similar type treatment to manage the network they have. And last but not least, anything that we do as a state agency, we're going to have to protect the environment the best way we can. And there are lots and lots of laws and guidelines that we must follow to build roads. And a lot of times people wonder why it takes so long to build a road. Well, part of that is the environmental process of building roadways. It just takes a long time. If you ever build any projects with federal money, you'll know what we're talking about. All right, let's talk about the plan and how we're trying to use the plan. We see that the plan we have now is really a business case for transportation investment. The goal here was at the start of the session, the plan, according to last year's Senate Bill 200, was due by December 31st. So a draft version of that plan was due then. So the legislators had this plan the whole way through. We wanted the legislators to have cover throughout the legislative process to say, yes, there is a need for additional investment in transportation. Fortunately, for those who have been paying attention to the Georgia General Assembly last Wednesday night, late in the evening, the General Assembly did pass a funding bill, which is great news for Georgia. That is going to help us in a lot of ways. But in order to pass that funding bill, they needed to have a business case to say, yeah, we needed it in the first place. So the goal of the plan was to inform and guide public dialogue away from you give me a list, you give me a list. Instead, what is the most important project strategically for the state? What makes the most business case? What makes the most sense from a results-based decision process? The plan does not favor planes, trains, or automobiles. It favors performance per taxpayers' money. Now, what we did here a little bit different when we looked at the plan, we looked at access to talent pools when we were considering road projects. That's not something Georgia really had done before. We kind of had sort of considered it, but we never had quantified it. And certainly when a company, say Hewlett-Packard, is considering locating on the top end of 285, well, they look at the access to talent pools. And if you look at a map of Atlanta, the access to that, if they go out and get college degree people to work there, that access point is pretty far out. And they can recruit people from 20, 30 miles away within a 45-mile trip. Excuse me, a 45-minute trip. Well, if you look at 2030 and the volumes and the population growth, that area of reach that they have to recruit people from becomes very, very small. So if you're Hewlett-Packard, maybe you decide, well, Georgia's not the place I want to go because I can't get workers to my building. And the same thing applies on the logistics side. So we looked at access, making sure that people can get where they want to go in a reliable fashion. Now, the concept of a reliable project, well, that's something new to a lot of Georgians. And an example of that is what we call managed lanes. So certain lanes on the freeway will be tolled. And they will be tolled such that the demand on the lane will not exceed the capacity. So we can guarantee at least a speed limit of 45 miles per hour or greater in those lanes. So if you have to get to a ball game, you have to get to a job interview, you have to get to an important client meeting, you're willing to pay a toll to get in that lane to have a reliable trip in that lane. Well, that opens up the access to talent pools in certain corridors if you implement a managed lane system plan all across the metro region. So that's a good example of that. Our planning office, who are represented here in the corner over here, did a great job pulling together a nice plan for Atlanta. We know we can't widen the freeways to 15, 20 lanes wide each direction, so the managed lane concept is what Georgia's looking at, as well as many other states. We're not the first. There's several in place now. Miami just opened one, and these will work. We know they will. In other states that have implemented them, they have been very, very successful. Last but not least in our plan, we did have a big emphasis on the efficient and affordable movement of freight, which was very, very important. Another aspect in the plan is anytime you allocate new resources, if you were happen to be lucky enough to get new resources, which we were last week, pending the governor's signature. I wish he was here to say that again, but if he signs the bill, we'll have opportunity to really get new funding. So if you get the funding, it's going to be limited. So you got to make sure that the desired outcomes are in place. So as part of the bill that passed last week, there are a lot of performance measures, a lot of requirements about the types of projects that you put in that plan. And they have to meet certain criteria. The plan really looks at three different areas, and I mentioned before freight was a key component. Now I'll mention that first since that's first on the list here. We know that as we move forward, the economic upside of the port and GDP growth is good right now, but we know if we don't do anything, if we have the current resources we have at hand today, then we're in trouble. Let me back up a second and tell you, so you know, when you gas up at the pump, you pay for transportation in Georgia. Currently, you pay 18.4 cents a gallon that goes straight to the federal government for every gallon you put in your tank. On the state side, you put about 14.5 cents a gallon that goes to the DOT. Well, those combined together, 33, 34 cents per gallon, those are used to fund transportation. Now, think for a second what has happened over the last several years. The amount of vehicle miles traveled in this country has slowed down considerably with the economy. It's kind of flattened for the most part. What has happened to the types of cars you're buying? They're becoming more fuel efficient. If y'all watched the news 3 or 4 weeks ago, President Obama announced new CAFE standards requiring cars to get 30 plus miles per gallon as soon as 2015. So if your fleet that's out there working, cars, trucks, all together, increases fuel efficiency by 25% over the next 5 years, what does that do to your revenues for transportation? You decrease by 25%. So we're not looking at the same level of transportation funding in the future. We're actually looking at a decrease, even with inflation. So that's not a pretty picture. So what happens is, under the plan, if we're flat or decreasing in revenues, we know that our economic upside of freight movement is going to be really bad because companies, once again, what I said before, they won't want to come here. They won't want to come through Georgia because we're limited. So we've got to make the path straight for these folks. And we know the other ports, what are they going to do? They're investing now. Biloxi, Alabama, they're investing. Up in New York, they're investing. We had one of our engineers spent some time in New Jersey just last week up at New Brunswick Port. They're doing a lot up there. So we've got to be prepared to be economically competitive with them. In the metro Atlanta area, obviously we looked at capacity, and that relates back to logistics big time because we know that a lot of the trucks that come through Georgia come through Atlanta. The trains that come through Georgia, they come through Atlanta. We got all kind of capacity issues on both the rail side and the truck side. And then the medium-sized cities, like I said before, even the medium-sized cities in 2030 on the current funding course will not go places. So this is a breakdown of how Georgia spends its money, of that 14.5 cents per gallon or so. And that changes every 6 months, by the way, because part of our gas tax in Georgia is based on a percentage. But this is fiscal 2011 budget right here. But you can see a big part of the Georgia budget is debt service, paying for our previous projects that are out there and built today. Next part is general operation. That piece gets squeezed year after year, the operations and maintenance of our roadways. And that's what I was talking about before. We may have good roads now and rated very highly, but the problem is in the future, we keep squeezing that piece of the pie, we're not going to have good roads. We have to match our federal aid program. The federal government is going through the same exact problems here in Georgia. How do you fund transportation? In fact, the country is under a continuing resolution of a funding bill that expired last fall. This is the third or fourth resolution. And they have the exact same problems. They cannot fund the Transportation Trust Fund in Washington at the level they want to fund it because the gas tax revenues aren't high enough. So they've been stealing money from the general fund in Washington. Of course, they actually haven't been stealing money because the money doesn't exist. They borrow money, right, from other countries. But essentially making infusions from the general fund into the Highway Trust Fund. So getting money from the general fund in Washington to fund transportation probably is not a very reliable mechanism. So they're grappling with the same problems and the same issues we were in Georgia. Now, fortunately, House Bill 277 passed last Wednesday. I'm going to give you this will be a 30-second overview of the bill. But this bill is very significant and could help Georgia out tremendously in the future. It breaks Georgia into 12 regional commissions. These commission boundaries can be found on the web. You can look at them. They're the regional commission boundaries that were adopted last July for other planning activities. We're going to use those same boundaries. In Atlanta, for instance, it's the 10 counties in the Atlanta area. On the coast, you got about 13 or 14 counties along the coast, spanning from Effingham County down through Savannah all the way down to Camden County on the border near Jacksonville. So no county within the district can opt out on its own. The district boundaries vote for a list of projects, and this list of projects is developed with basically the help of a regional roundtable. Let me back up and let me get them all on the screen at the same time. This regional roundtable is made up of county commissioners and mayors from that region. And working with the director of planning, my position, we lay out the criteria like I talked about before, and then we help them with a draft list. They ultimately take the draft list and pick projects from that draft list to put ultimately before the voters. The voters will see a question. This will be next in November of 2012. They'll see a question on the ballot that says, do you support a regional sales tax? And there will not be a list necessarily in your ballot, but the list will be just like any spliced in the counties you live in today. I suspect most of you live in a county that has some type of education splice or a regular splice for jails and parks and even local transportation needs. It'll be very similar to that. So this tax will be levied for a 10-year period. So it could generate a lot of money. In Atlanta, it generates about $750 million a year. To give you a perspective of how much that is, we generally spend probably, when you count engineering, right-of-way, and construction, a little over $1 billion a year in what we get from the feds and our match. All right, so you're talking about, in Atlanta alone, almost getting 75% of what the whole state gets. When you combine the whole state, it's about double 750, so let's call it $1.5 billion per year. So you're talking about a program that's actually larger than our existing program, so doubling up what you're doing. So this has a chance to double down and really make some headways. But ultimately, it'll be up to me and you, the voters, right, to actually pull the lever and say yes or not. So we've got to do a good job marketing this. One reason this bill is not being done sooner than that, why is it, you may ask, why is it not in November? Well, the problem is getting all the criteria set, work in developing the roundtables. You've got to do that over a period of time. We could not do that by this fall. Calendar year 11, you may not know this, and there's no general election in Georgia. And they want to do this at one time under one general election, so they did not want to have a special election. So you have to wait to 2012 for the next general election. So there's been some discussions about when to do this. Should you do it at the primary in the summer, or you should wait until November? There's arguments for both, but this bill allows us to do it in 2012. All right, now let's get back to zeroing in. You got the Commission for New Georgia, you got the statewide plan, and now you got the freight and logistics plan that we're working on. With the freight and logistics plan, had a starting point. It cobbled together a number of different efforts that have been done over the last 10 years or so, starting with a Central Georgia corridor study, an interstate system plan that we had done, a freight planning guidebook, a statewide freight plan that we worked on back in 2006. We created a freight corridor, who's here tonight. It's not tonight, it's night, it's daytime. And freight corridor coordinator within GDOT, which is a big deal. We also did a truck-only lane feasibility study around the metro Atlanta area. So we cobble these studies together, and that's a starting point for our consultant, which is Cambridge Systematic. They're the prime that we chose, I guess, 3 or 4 months ago, and they're getting going on their plan now. Now, these are other freight partnerships that we can tap into. You recognize some of these, obviously, but some of these groups have a lot of data. They have a lot of information that we can use together to help frame our work. I particularly have been involved in some of the I-95 work. Now, you think I-95 coalition, they're not talking about just the I-95 corridor. They're talking about all the states along the I-95 corridor. And they've done a lot of work in regards to freight up and down the east coast of the United States. A lot of you probably haven't heard of the El Camino corridor. I had not heard of that. Did you know that there's an El Camino group that their sole intent is to have a 4-lane highway from Brunswick, Georgia to San Antonio, Texas, and ultimately on to El Paso. And Georgia has 26 miles of US 84 that are not 4-lane highway. The rest of it is 4-lane. So you got a bunch of different groups out there with different agendas and different things, but it all helps in the big picture of freight and logistics in Georgia. All right, so currently under development, like I said a minute ago, we're getting a good start with our consultant, and we've had we've had kickoff meetings and a number of interagency meetings, and we're setting goals and performance measures for all modes of transportation. And ultimately, the guidance we're going to set for this will improve the flow of commerce into and out of the state of Georgia, and obviously providing options will be an absolute key for the plan. Now, on the supply side, we're going to look at what we have today. We've got a good network to start with on the highway side. We've got some good railroad network in Georgia. Our state was founded on the road network, so we've got a lot of those road networks still in place. Some of them don't have the capacity they need, but certainly a good starting point. We have some bad linkages right now on some of our intermodal connections and terminals. In our ports, we've got 2 great ports with Brunswick and Savannah. There's a lot of talk about doing inland ports. Some of you probably have heard Cordele, Georgia is making a headway. They bought a large tract of land off I-75, and they are building an inland port. So in other words, cargo will come by rail to the inland port, and then from the inland port, they will get on rubber tire trucks and go north and south along I-75 and further west along US 280 toward Columbus. So there's just lots of efforts throughout the state to be real strategic in nature. Obviously, capturing what the capacity we have out there is going to be key to meeting the demand of the road network. So all right, so where are our weaknesses? We're going to identify those. We're going to look at freight movement along those corridors, and ultimately looking at last mile connectivity issues throughout the state, which will be absolutely key. And Savannah's got a great project I use as a last mile connector example. We want to build the Jimmy DeLoach Parkway, which will be a parallel facility to State Route 21 down in Savannah. It will allow trucks, once they get there, to get there. Because that's part of the problem. Once you get to Savannah, you still got to navigate all the surface streets of Savannah. This will allow somewhat of a limited access, direct access into the port. Another piece of this pie that we're looking at is the economic side. You're going to hear from a couple of speakers that speak a little bit about the economic forecast. We're going to be looking at those as well. And then we're going to look at determine the benefit cost ratios for all the identified products that we have in the plan. And then we'll look at performance metrics to match that supply and demand, as I mentioned before. All right. One of the most important starting points is to get input from groups like you. So there is actually a survey that's being done. Some of you saw that during the registration process. We're trying to get as much input as possible. There's a survey that's out there. It's going to be available to the 15th of May. And this survey is manufacturers, logistic consultants, chambers of commerce, third-party logistics, any kind of transportation provider at all. In the data that we have so far, we've gotten 100 surveys back, and we're finding that reliability, congestion, and safety tend to be the greater issues that come back with the people that are giving us comments. And if you really dig down a little deeper, what you're finding is they say capacity probably is the biggest concern, and we probably inherently knew that because we get a lot of comments in GDOT already, but they actually identified a number of different areas, pinch points that are real big for freight logistics, and of course they are not surprising. The 285s of the world, the I-20s, the need for some kind of connector across the top end, 85 north of 285 up toward South Carolina is a pinch point for them, and Jimmy DeLoach Parkway down in Savannah is another one mentioned as well. So the final product of the plan is going to identify the critical needs by all modes. It's going to address those bottlenecks. It's going to address the benefit cost analysis, and it's going to deliver a strategic framework in which policymakers can make decisions. And it will have to be done in recognition of funding resources and restrictions. So with that, I've probably gone over my time a little bit. I hope you will stay to the end. There'll be a panel discussion. You can ask me further questions at that time. So thank you very much for your attendance.